Donald Trump isn't slowing down. He's not backing off. He's not softening the language. And he's definitely not testing limits quietly anymore. What just happened over the past few weeks changes the tone entirely because this isn't about rhetoric drifting too far on social media. This is about a former and potentially future U.S. president openly treating military force like a casual policy option against neighbors after military action tied to Venezuela, after floating the idea of annexing Greenland like it was a real estate deal. Donald Trump has now taken another step that shifts the entire equation. He's openly threatened military action against Mexico, and if that doesn't immediately make Canada pause, it should. Because history is very clear about one thing. When a U.S. president starts talking openly about using force against neighboring countries, the list rarely stays short. It doesn't stop neatly at one border. It expands, it tests, it normalizes, and eventually, it reaches places people assumed were untouchable.
Analysts say Canada could be most exposed.
If you are weak and you are doing stuff Trump doesn't like, and you can be an ally or you can be an adversary, right? You can be Canada or you can be Venezuela, but you get FAFO'd.
In a recent interview with the New York Times, Trump said that he's not constrained by international law or Congress, but by his own morality. He says that's the only thing that can stop.
Here's where things get interesting. Trump isn't being vague about Mexico. He isn't speaking hypothetically. He's talking in direct operational terms. He said the U.S. has knocked out 97.
Trump is signaling he may send American troops onto Mexican soil.
We've knocked out 97% of the drugs coming in by water, and we are going to start now hitting land with regard to the cartels. The cartels are running Mexico.
Mexico has previously turned down Trump's offer of military intervention, but is concerned Trump will act on his own, like he did in Venezuela.
And I think for Canada, that's also dangerous.
Percent of drugs coming in by water, and is now going to start hitting land with regard to the cartels. He's framed this as a counterterrorism mission, narco-terrorism, security intervention, necessary force. Mexico's response has been immediate and clear. No. Full stop.
So with the capture of Nicolas Maduro and the talk of Trump trying to take over Greenland, plus all those 51st state threats last year,
I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
that suddenly propelled the question, is Canada under threat from the US? Well, not exactly, but many of the experts we spoke to are increasingly concerned by the moves from the Trump administration.
In the last 2 weeks, there's been another shift, another fundamental shift that suggests that the world is even more dangerous now for Canada than it was before.
Now, those concerns stem from a statement from the White House on Tuesday, saying that the US wants to acquire Greenland for security reasons and is discussing a range of options, including utilizing the US military. Thomas Homer-Dixon, executive director at the Cascade Institute, says Canada should be prepared for possible military coercion from the United States.
The Trump administration might try to use some kind of explicit or implicit military coercion against us, either in the Arctic or with respect to some of the boundaries, Canadian boundaries, which President Trump has already declared he doesn't think are legally valid.
He says the fact that the Trump administration has been so explicit about possible military intervention in Greenland, it's really set the tone for Canada.
In a sense,
Mexican officials have rejected U.S. military intervention outright, arguing that sovereignty isn't negotiable and that American troops on Mexican soil would be unacceptable under any justification. But here's the part most people miss. That rejection doesn't actually stop Trump, because we've already seen how he behaves when consent gets in the way. Venezuela is the example everyone keeps circling back to. When Trump decided Nicolas Maduro's government was illegitimate, he didn't treat international law as a binding framework. He treated it like a suggestion. Sanctions escalated. Covert actions followed. Pressure campaigns intensified. The message was simple. If Washington decides a situation is a security issue, the usual rules can be bent. That mindset matters because Trump has been very explicit about how he sees power. In a recent interview with the New York Times, he said he isn't constrained by Congress or international law. He said the only thing that limits him is his own morality. That statement alone should give allies pause. Because that means checks, balances, treaties, and norms don't function as guardrails in his worldview. They function as obstacles. And obstacles, in his political language, are meant to be overcome. Now here's the twist that directly involves Canada. Canada is not a bystander in this story. From the start of Trump's latest political chapter, Canada and Mexico have been treated as a package deal. When Trump talks about border security, fentanyl, trade enforcement, or economic leverage, he consistently lumps the two together, regardless of scale, responsibility, or facts. That framing isn't accidental. It reveals how Trump views North America, not as three sovereign partners with distinct roles and boundaries, but as one pressure zone, a region where force, tariffs, threats, and leverage can be applied interchangeably depending on what produces results. Canada has already heard versions of this language before. Jokes about Canada being the 51st state, dismissive remarks about the legitimacy of Canadian borders, casual rhetoric that treats sovereignty as flexible or outdated. At the time, many people brushed it off as trolling, as exaggeration, as political theater. But when you place those comments next to military threats against Mexico, annexation talk about Greenland, and security-based justifications for unilateral action, the tone changes. The pattern becomes harder to ignore. Look at the progression. First, Venezuela was framed as a security threat that justified intervention. Then Greenland was framed as a national defense necessity. Arctic positioning, shipping lanes, military access. Now Mexico is framed as a counterterrorism problem requiring boots on the ground. Different countries, different justifications, same underlying logic. Force is acceptable in the Western Hemisphere if it serves U.S. interests. That's not normal, and it represents a profound shift in how power is being discussed, especially by someone who could soon be back in the Oval Office. This is where analysts start sounding alarms about Canada, not because tanks are about to roll across the border. That's not the realistic fear. The real risk is something quieter, subtler, and far more dangerous in the long term. Implicit coercion, assumed authority, unilateral actions justified as shared security measures. That could look like increased U.S. military presence in Canadian airspace or waters without meaningful consultation, temporary patrols that quietly become permanent, security decisions being made for Canada, not with Canada. And here's why that matters. Sovereignty doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes, slowly, through precedent, through normalization, through the quiet acceptance of temporary arrangements that never fully unwind. Greenland and Mexico might seem unrelated at first glance. They're not. Trump's fixation on Greenland has always been about the Arctic. Shipping lanes opening as ice melts, access to energy resources, strategic military positioning as global competition intensifies. The Arctic is becoming one of the most contested regions on the planet. Canada's Arctic infrastructure is growing, but it's still developing. Presence is increasing, but it remains thin in key areas. That creates temptation, not necessarily for conquest, but for assumption. Assuming patrols are necessary, assuming authority in the name of shared defense, assuming Canada will quietly accept it for the sake of alliance harmony. That's how sovereignty gets tested in the modern era. And this concern isn't coming from fringe voices. Thomas Homer Dixon, executive director of the Cascade Institute, has warned openly that Canada should be prepared for explicit or implicit military coercion from the United States, not because Washington wants conflict, but because the current rhetoric lowers the threshold for force. He's pointed out that Trump has already questioned the legal validity of certain Canadian boundaries. When leaders openly question borders, even rhetorically, it shifts expectations, and expectations shape behavior. This is where the tension really comes from. Canada depends heavily on a rules-based international system, multilateral institutions, clear borders, legal constraints on force. Canada has been one of the strongest defenders of that system in the Western Hemisphere. That makes Canada a stabilizer, but it also makes Canada vulnerable when that system is weakened. When force becomes normalized as policy, countries that rely on rules instead of raw power feel the impact first. But here's the part that often gets overlooked. Canada isn't frozen, Canada isn't silent, and Canada isn't waiting to see what happens. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada has been actively insulating itself from exactly this kind of pressure. Diplomatic ties with Europe have been strengthened. NATO allies have been vocal. France has explicitly warned that threats against Canada would damage the global order itself. Arctic commitments are being reinforced. Defense coordination is being revisited. Canada has made it clear that it is not standing alone, and that matters. Trump's strategy has always relied on isolation. Pressure works best when a country is alone, distracted, or diplomatically boxed in. Canada made a deliberate choice not to let that happen. By building alliances early, by aligning visibly with other regions facing similar rhetoric, and by anchoring itself firmly in global norms, Canada changed the math. Any threat to Canada now wouldn't be a quiet bilateral issue. It would ripple outward. It would trigger diplomatic, economic, and strategic consequences far beyond North America. And despite his public bravado, Trump understands consequences. He just prefers to pretend they don't apply to him. So when Trump threatens Mexico, Canada should absolutely pay attention, not because war is imminent, but because restraint is no longer assumed, because the language has shifted, because force is being discussed casually, repeatedly, and publicly. But here's the reality Trump may be underestimating. Canada is backed, Canada is alert, and Canada is no longer alone. Any attempt to coerce Canada now wouldn't project strength. It would expose recklessness. And it would likely be the biggest strategic mistake Donald Trump could make. If you value clear, serious analysis of what's happening around Canada, without panic, without spin, consider subscribing. I appreciate you, and now I want to hear from you. After Trump's threats against Mexico, his actions in Venezuela, and his annexation talk around Greenland, do you think Canada is doing enough to prepare, or should Ottawa be moving faster? Let me know in the comments. I read them all.